Hi, Dr. Kang. Thank you for joining us with Deccan Health. So I'd like to begin by asking you, you know how the pulse polio immunization program rolled out in the country, you know how the rotavirus vaccine immunization rolled out in our country. What do you anticipate are challenges for the COVID vaccination?
I think the scale of the challenge is just incredible. We are talking now about vaccinating the entire country. Whereas for the polio program, we vaccinate usually, even in the national immunization days, which are really large campaigns, we only vaccinate less than 10% of the population. And if we look at routine immunization, that vaccinates every year about 1/50th of the population. Now we are talking about vaccinating everybody at least once, possibly twice. And that is going to be very difficult in a country where the only adult immunization we do is in the private sector or is for pregnant women. So the logistics, the cold chain, the training of people, the tracking of vaccines, everything is going to be a problem. And that comes even after being able to afford the vaccine and having manufacturers that make enough vaccine for us.
I'm slightly off topic, but I have to ask you this. What do you make of the declining COVID numbers in India right now?
I think the declining COVID numbers are a feature of having passed the peak. But passing one peak does not mean that we are done with this pandemic. It's been shown in other countries as well that you may have not just more than one peak, more than two peaks sometimes. And if this is going to be a seasonal virus, we might wind up in a situation where you have a peak or two peaks every year, like we do with influenza. So I think declining numbers right now are a good thing, except in Delhi, the situation is not particularly stressed in many places. People are breathing a sigh of relief, but that sigh of relief does not mean that we go back to behaving the way we did before the pandemic was around.
Do you have any fears with regard to the COVID vaccines outcome that are currently in development? What could go wrong?
I'm actually feeling more and more reassured with the kind of data that are emerging. The two vaccines for which we have substantial efficacy data, the two mRNA vaccines. This is a new platform and mRNA can be quite inflammatory. So if we are seeing independent data safety monitoring boards saying that this has good clinical efficacy and they have no concerns about the safety, that makes me feel a lot more comfortable with the vaccines. Of course, we want to see long-term data and we want to see more immunological data on people who have this vaccine, not immediately after they get vaccinated alone, but also on longer-term follow-up. And the amount of safety data that will be required will depend very much on the platform on which these vaccines are being made. So for example, if you have a vaccine with a platform that is very well known, then you might want shorter duration safety, or you might want not to track certain immunological parameters that are not relevant to that vaccine platform.
So it has been reported that the country is identifying close to 30,000 beneficiaries who will be vaccinated on priority. But how do we make a distinction? How do we prioritize, let's say, an elderly with comorbidities over police personnel or sanitation workers who are exposed to higher load of the virus?
So I think the thing we need to remember is that ultimately everybody is going to get the vaccine if they want to get it, right? It's a question of when they get the vaccine. So if we think about who should be prioritized, obviously the initial thinking is let's prioritize those who are most at risk of getting infection and most at risk of severe disease. Hence the prioritization of healthcare workers and frontline workers, followed by the elderly, followed by people with comorbidities. My concerns are not so much about people who are defined by their occupations, because you know where someone works. But if you start to say, now I need to identify all the elderly, how do we know that we are going to get straightforward age records? A lot of people in the country don't have a birth certificate, don't have accurate age information. Fraud, forgery are all concerns there. And that's for age. And then if you move to people with comorbidities, I can see, a black market in certificates saying that this person has diabetes or hypertension or whatever. So I think in terms of the government, it needs to be very clearly spelled out that this is the approach that is going to be taken, and strong measures need to be put in place demonstrating how the logistics of giving the vaccine to different priority groups is going to be arranged.
The center on September 10th, it wrote to all states, including Karnataka, that they have to identify under-repaired freezers and other vaccine equipment at their vaccine stores. Now, at that time, when our newspaper had asked the state immunization wing about basic questions like how many of your ice-lined refrigerators are small, how many are big, they didn't have answers to that. So 9 weeks later, does India have a better sense of its cold storage capacity?
I think the government has reached out not only to its own program, it's also been talking to people who are in the private sector, particularly with regard to agri-storage, because a lot of cold chain capacity, much more than for medicines and vaccines, is for food storage. And if we have vaccines that can be held at 2 to 8 degrees, then it's very possible that we will be able to expand cold storage capacity, at least for the period that is required, by borrowing from the private sector or borrowing from parts of the government that are not directly related to health.
You've previously spoken about how parts of India are not totally electrified, and it is easier perhaps to bring people to the vaccine than vice versa. So can you elaborate on that, ma'am? Is it financially viable to do that?
So I think if you think about how this vaccination is going to work, it's going to be repeated cycles that go back to the same place over time. So if you think about a village, you're going to go to that village and you're going to first time vaccinate the ASHA worker from that village. Then the next time you go, you will vaccinate the elderly people. Then you'll go again, you'll vaccinate the people with comorbidities. Then you'll go for the school teachers and school children. Then you'll go for everybody else. How many times will you go to the village? If the numbers are small enough, doesn't it make sense to bring the people who need to be vaccinated to a place where you can efficiently give vaccine rather than take the vaccine to people? So I think I just highlighted that as an example of the need for flexibility in designing programs to make sure that everybody who should get the vaccine at a certain time does have the opportunity to get it.
So the Pulse Polio program in India brilliantly mapped out the country's vaccine distribution network. And what lessons can the COVID distribution take away from our early experiences with polio?
This is already happening. Many of the people who were in the National Polio Surveillance Program are now using the skills that they developed for what's called micro-planning, for the identification of places where children are and strategies where vaccines can be given. Those skills are being put to use in the planning for the COVID-19 vaccines, and this will be very valuable. It is something, however, that will need to be updated over time, because as I mentioned, if there are going to be multiple cycles of immunization of different groups at different times, then we are going to need to each time have a different micro-planning exercise.
Right. So we were speaking with syringe manufacturers previously, and one of them mentioned that India at least needs 1.8 billion syringes to vaccinate at least 70% of the population with 2 doses of the COVID vaccine. He also mentioned that we'll need disposables like alcohol swabs, Dettol, Savlon, gloves, bags to dispose the sharps and everything. So is India poised to ramp up capacity on all fronts in a year's
I
time?
think that's a pretty conservative estimate, actually, because a lot depends on how the immunization vial is structured, because you need a needle for withdrawal and you can't use the same needle for injection. So it's possible that we might need many more than 1.8 billion syringes. But whether it is waste disposal, or it is gloves, or it is alcohol, or it is cotton swabs, I think all of this needs to be planned when we are thinking about delivering immunizations to people across the country. Not going to be easy.
Right. So the lowest price, proposed price of the vaccines under development is $3 by the Serum Institute of India of Pune.
Yeah.
And as Adar Poonawala's famous tweet said, that India requires 80,000 crores to, to fund the vaccine. What do you think of affordability of these vaccines? Can we afford any vaccine higher than $3 per dose?
I think it would be very challenging. Even at $3 a dose, it will be the most expensive vaccine that the program has ever had. The most expensive vaccine that we have currently is the pneumococcal vaccine, and that at the Gavi price is now less than $3 a dose. So in fact, Serum Institute is going to be making it available for less than the current price, which I think was $295. So this will be an extremely expensive vaccine for the program, but what Mr. Poonawala is stating is actually less than 1/10 of the cost that we've heard for the Moderna vaccine. So if we are to have enough vaccine for our people, it will most likely come from Indian manufacturers. And I think, one, they need to be commended for that. And quite frankly, the government needs to find the money for that. This is a small price to pay for all the benefits that vaccines can bring.
I know that there is an ethical debate surrounding this topic, but should vaccination be made mandatory, given that a scale of this kind, a pandemic of this kind, has never been seen before?
So there are questions about all kinds of infectious diseases, about what is public good versus individual choice. So let's forget about SARS coronavirus 2 and let's talk about measles. Now, in measles, the immunization for measles in India is given at 9 months, and then there is a second dose of a measles vaccine that is given over 1 year of age. In the West, measles is given when children are over 1 year of age, and they give 2 doses of the vaccine as well. Now, when parents become conscientious objectors, as happens in some parts of California and others, what it does is you can choose for your own children, but if your child passes on measles to somebody else's child before they have the opportunity to get vaccinated themselves, that young child can die. And it has happened that a 6-month-old child got infected by a cousin who was unvaccinated, and the 6-month-old child died. Now, you may have made a choice for yourself, you may have made a choice for your child, but you did not have the right to make a choice for somebody else's child. And that effectively is what happens. You can't think about a situation where you say, I'm not vaccinating my child, and then send that child out to spread infection to others. So I think these are debates that need to be had, and there need to be some kind of mitigation strategies that we think about for handling the people who, for some reason or the other, do not want to get vaccinated, or in some situations cannot be vaccinated. So, for example, immunocompromised individuals cannot be given live vaccines because of the danger of replication in them. But for others who have a choice and who are healthy, where do you say individual freedom and public responsibility can both be managed?
There was some debate about another related topic as well. Should people be paid to get COVID vaccination shots? What are your thoughts on this?
Quite frankly, why should people be paid to get something that benefits them? I know we have done it in the past as an incentive. We incentivize mothers who deliver in facilities. We incentivize them for antenatal visits. We incentivize children for being immunized. But most of that is to bring people to public healthcare facilities where, for one reason or the other, they wouldn't be able to access them. And it's also to give women a little more control over their health and the health of their children. So if conditional cash transfers have benefit, I think it is something that is a very good public health tool, but it probably works better as a program rather than as a one-off. Come and have a vaccine and be given money for it. It's kind of like saying when each time you donate blood, you get tea and a cup and biscuits or something like that. I think programmatic is better than one-offs when it comes to these kinds of benefits.
Also, should the COVID vaccine be reserved for the public sector, or should a part of it also be diverted to the private sector? Should it be commercially available?
So this brings us to the question of equity. If there are doses of vaccine that are available, should people who can afford to pay for vaccines have greater access than people who cannot afford to pay for vaccines when there is limiting supply? So one way to handle this is, we know that in the public health program, and this is also potentially ethically contentious, if you can say in the public health program, we are going to have these 2, 3, or 4 vaccines, then all of the supply of vaccines for those products should be in the public program. And there may be other vaccines which, for reasons of price or storage, you could look at the Moderna vaccine. $37 a dose is unaffordable for the Indian vaccination program. Then should you say we won't bring Moderna vaccine into the country, or say let's bring the vaccine into the country and let that be in the private sector? So for people where money is no object, really charge them a hefty price and preferably use that to subsidize a program for poorer people who can't afford the vaccine.
So I am literally reading off a Daily Mail report about volunteers on the Pfizer vaccine trial having, suffered side effects like which they describe as severe hangover, and some of them report headaches, fever, muscle aches. There's another volunteer who says that her effects were severe after the second dose was administered. So should we be concerned about these reports of side effects of vaccines?
I think with every vaccine, you need to make sure that we continue to monitor side effects. Vaccines are given to healthy people. And while we recognize that giving a vaccine, the act of vaccination, leads to, if it is an injectable vaccine, redness, pain, swelling, fever. These are a small price to pay for being protected from a worse infection further down the track. But the reason that we do phase 1 studies is to make sure that vaccines don't have so much of this side effect that nobody would take the vaccine. In any vaccine trial, if you see, there will always be some people who will react worse than others. It's like antibiotics. Some people, every time they take an antibiotic, they get diarrhea. Other people take an antibiotic and nothing happens to them. So where do you draw the line on side effects and the potential benefit of the drug? So for the Pfizer trial, we'll have to look at what the rates of these infections, the rates of these side effects are. Is it happening in 1 in 100 people? Is it happening in 1 in 10 people? Or is it happening in 1 in 1,000 people? Once we know what the rates are, then we'll have a better understanding of how much of discomfort people will have to undergo to have a vaccine that works.
I know this question has been asked ad nauseum to you, but is India simply in a position to benefit from Pfizer's vaccine, given its ultra cold chain requirement?
I think it's challenging. I know that Pfizer has developed a cold chain system, their own proprietary system, working also with partners that they are planning to make available with their vaccine. And that is really commendable on the part of Pfizer to have had the foresight to think about all of this. Now, for the Ebola vaccine, -70 was delivered, but it was delivered for a much smaller number of doses than we are thinking about at the moment. So while it would be feasible to use such a system in major cities, I think it would be extremely challenging to get these systems out in to really remote areas. It's not impossible. Anything is possible if you put enough resources behind it. But is this the best use of our resources? I think we will have other vaccines that will probably have better performance characteristics and easier storage than the Pfizer vaccine, and they are not very far away. So while Pfizer is, it's fantastic. Is it really right to be the biggest vaccine in our program? I'm not so sure. I'd like to wait and see.
On a related note, you must have read that Indian Institute of Science, a biophysicist here, he is in the process of developing a heat-tolerant vaccine. What do you think? Does it benefit a tropical country like ours?
I think Raghavan is a phenomenal scientist. And I think the work that he's doing is very, very important. So one of the things is that people have tried to develop thermostable vaccines before, but the problem previously was that if you have most of the vaccines that were being developed for routine immunization. And in routine immunization, just having one vaccine out of the cold chain does not help, because all the other vaccines have to be in the cold chain, so you might as well have them all together or have none. And to convert all routine vaccines to ones that don't need the cold chain is a huge challenge. So, but when you're talking about it, that hasn't taken off because of the complication of many vaccines. But if you're talking about campaigns, and this vaccine can be given in campaigns, then it makes sense to have a heat-stable vaccine that you can take anywhere and give anywhere without needing to worry about cold chain. Will really make a lot of difference to our ability to deliver this vaccine, particularly in remote parts of the country.
So this challenge of our vaccine distribution system geared towards immunizing children but not adults, is it unique to India, or do we have other countries facing a similar challenge?
So in many Western countries, influenza vaccination given every year is recommended for large parts of the adult population. In some countries, for all people, annual influenza immunization is recommended. In most low and middle income countries, the focus has been very much on early childhood immunization and on maternal immunization for tetanus. Even the introduction of a school-based vaccination program, such as for the HPV vaccine, has been extremely challenging. So this is not a problem that is unique to us. It is there in vast parts of the world. So we're all going to struggle together.
So experts have said that especially in the context of COVID vaccines, that rich countries will have more access to COVID vaccines than poorer countries and middle income countries. Do you think India will be able to wriggle out of this rich versus poor country tough spot that it is in?
I actually think that in India we are incredibly fortunate. And the reason that we are fortunate is because we have vaccine manufacturing companies that are responsible for more doses of vaccines than for any other country in the world. And our vaccine companies have so many ongoing programs at the moment that I am pretty sure that several of those programs are going to succeed and we will have vaccines available. The question to me really is, should we keep all that vaccine for ourselves first, or should we share in a graded manner with the rest of the world and wait our turn? So that if there is a priority group, it's a global priority group and not a country-wide priority group. The fact that countries like the US are indulging in vaccine nationalism, wanting to vaccinate their entire populations first, doesn't mean that we have to behave the same way. I would rather that we played our part as good global citizens and contributed to public health around the world, as well as in our country. How that is to be managed, I would leave up to the government, but I certainly think that we should not be behaving in the same way that many other countries are. It's a matter of a year or two, and it's very important to understand that this virus does not affect all groups the same way. You are going to have many parts of the population that can afford to wait because the chances of them having severe disease are much, much less than for, let's say, an older individual in Spain or in Argentina.
In your previous experience of vaccine development, do you think India does enough random inspections of its clinical trial sites?
I think there's always room for improvement. So in terms of what is being done with clinical trials, the new clinical trial rules that came out last year are good rules and should be something that raise the standard of clinical research in the country. But in order to do good monitoring of clinical trials, you need people who are trained to do that monitoring. And there aren't many independent groups that do monitoring of clinical studies in India. I think monitoring is very positive. It helps people who are running studies to do way better than they would have. When you run a trial, sometimes you need a fresh pair of eyes to see how you're doing, or even if you've done things, you might not pick up on an error because sometimes your eye just goes over something that is very familiar to you but might stand out to an independent viewer.
Also, we wouldn't want the lab that's developing a particular vaccine to also vouch for its efficacy, for its safety. So, do we have the how do we develop confidence with third party verification of their claims?
So I think for vaccine developers, it's very good to have your clinical trial independently vetted, independently monitored, and the data safety monitoring board should not be made up of people who have any kind of conflict of interest. But when it comes to laboratory readouts as well, in the initial standardization of the assays, maybe the company can be involved because that's important to them. But it just gives people more confidence if the work that you are doing to measure immune responses is done by an independent laboratory, someone who in fact, even that independent laboratory should be testing blinded specimens. So they don't know whose specimens they are getting at what point in time. And if you do that, then you can rest assured that you will have robust readouts from your trial. That's what everybody wants. Good, well done studies that deliver quality products.
Do you think it is a breach of violation of clinical trial ethics and code of conduct that the media is so easily able to speak with trial participants and they are able to narrate their experiences with the vaccines under development?
So there is usually an issue of confidentiality when you participate in clinical research. But if you choose to talk to the media, that really is up to you. You should not be forced to talk to the media. But if you choose to talk about your experience, I think that might in many ways be helpful, in that it gives other people a good sense of what goes on in a clinical trial and reassures them that this is not some kind of magic or unwise experimentation. It really is a scientific process for the evaluation of new vaccines.
Thank you so much for talking to us today, ma'am.
Happy to talk anytime, Suraksha.